see? And Micah adds by saying, but each individual shall sit unto his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make him afraid. You have Hosea, for example, who says you trust in these weapons, but these weapons are going to be your ruin. The first person ever to condemn the belief that armaments is going to bring about salvation. So you have in the Bible this basic foundation that says, first, war is something that you have to do everything you can to avoid, that the buildup of weapons is something that is ultimately going to be self-defeating, and that the real goal has to be peace. Now, the way they actually try to implement that is by doing something that is totally and absolutely unique in the ancient world, which is to make a distinction between the kind of king that is the normal kind of king, which the Bible says is the kind of king that all the nations have, and the kind of king that the Israelites should have. And that is, if you look, for example, in the book of Deuteronomy, I think it's the 17th chapter, it says, if you want to appoint a king, first of all, he should not multiply horses. What does that mean? Horses means tanks. He shouldn't multiply weapons. Secondly, he shouldn't multiply wives, not because he's a sex maniac. Multiplying wives means having negotiated, organized links with other countries, because you married a woman because you can bring it's an ally, you see. Nor should he multiply silver and gold, because he needs the silver and gold to go to war. But what should he do? He should write this teaching, this Torah, this instruction, because Torah means instruction, and he should meditate on it day and night. And so for the first time ever, anywhere, it says that a king is subject to law, that a king is subject to God's rule. And what is unique in the Bible is that the law in the Bible is basically revealed law. It's divine law. Whereas if you look, for example, like even Exodus 21:23, which has a legal code, it's a code that is, in a sense, a divine code. It's God that gives the Torah. Whereas all the other ancient codes, it's the king. You see? Now, it's for this reason, it seems to me, that Judaism has consistently taken a position, which is a position that is anti-war, that is pro-peace. And there's only two arguments for war in the Bible. Keep in mind that the Bible did not invent reality. They found reality. It was a tribal, vicious reality where they would fight with one another. And basically what they ended up saying is there's two kinds of war. There's one war which says you should go to defeat all of the nations in Canaan. And the main reason that's given there is because these particular nations are horribly idolatrous nations. What they engage in is child sacrifice. They engage in the most perverse kinds of ritual sexual acts, these fertility cults and so forth. But those were only at that time. There's no longer any kind of a war of duty, okay? The other kind of war is a defensive war. In other words, you have to defend yourself. But it's interesting, it's the book of Deuteronomy that says if a man marries, he shouldn't go to war because he's got to take care of his wife for a year. If a man builds a house, he shouldn't go to war because he's got to take care of his house. If a man builds a garden, he shouldn't go to war. He's got to take care of his garden. So, well, who's left? You know what I'm saying? So the whole point of it is to do everything you can to not have this kind of war. Now, in view of the fact that the Jewish tradition firmly believes that war is something that should be avoided as much as possible, and that actually it is conceivable to have a society without war, they therefore did not accept the doctrine of a just war. And here let me indicate why, okay? The doctrine of a just war says that if you engage in war, then it has to be just and not unjust. Now, why would they come up with the doctrine of a just war? My own feeling, and I said this in this article on norms of war that was published by the United Nations, my own feeling is that if you really believe that you will always have war, then the best thing you can do is, well, let's contain it as much as possible. Let's restrict it as much as possible. Let's make it as less dangerous, less harmful, less destructive as possible. So the first thing they did is they said a just war is a war that will not affect non-combatants. In other words, if you're going to hurt people, you're going to have to hurt soldiers. You can't hurt you can't have quote-unquote collateral damage, as if the collateral damage is not human. You know, that in itself is an abomination, to use that word when you're talking about killing people who happen not to be soldiers. So the first point I want to make is that a just war tradition says you have to restrict the damage to soldiers and not non-soldiers. You have to have rules about going to war, what conditions would you go to war, rules in war, what would you do in war, and there's some, although not all, have rules about post-war. In other words, what conditions would you have? A good example of that is so much of the conditions after the war is to be so demanding and so punitive to the country that has lost that it actually brings the seeds of another war. Like you had this, for example, in the First World War, where the Germans were so restricted in so many ways. And it's the great glory of the United States that after the Second World War, they rehabilitated Europe with the Marshall Plan, $5 billion, Japan, $4 billion. So, from a Jewish perspective, and I'll end with this because my time is up, I would say that the best you can do is to have the least unjust war. You can't have a just war, but let it be the least unjust. But always recognize that if you're entering into a war, you're going to be guilty. You're going to be liable. And there's this wonderful passage in the Bible that a soldier has to make a contribution to the temple. And why does each soldier have to make a contribution? Because he may end up having to kill someone. And if he does kill someone, he's liable. And before he even does that, he has to offer an offering for atonement. And so I think the Jewish tradition is vehemently opposed to war. And I could go into the rabbinic tradition, the philosophical tradition. So I've done this in my essay. Maybe, Ibrahim, you'd be kind enough to send in your next mailings the reference so they can look at it. But that's the substance of what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.